What's the real job of an FBI profiler like? What's it like to be a detective or a federal prosecutor, or to make it your mission to catch the serial killer who killed your cousin? What's it like to be the father of a missing and murdered Indigenous woman? At the Silver Linings Handbook podcast, we explore conversations that inspire with people from all walks of life. I'm Jason Blair, the host. Come join us for these interesting conversations wherever you get your podcasts.
This week, we're continuing our journey back in time with Depression-era bank robber John Dillinger, whose terror gang has slowly been whittled down from 8 members to only 5, thanks to various deaths and arrests. Many of you already know how Dillinger's story ends, and don't worry, we are steadily approaching that moment. But there's so much more that happens along the way you don't want to miss on this episode of Vintage Villains. Welcome to Vintage Villains, everybody. I'm Allison Dickson, and I have been having a blast doing this deep dive on John Dillinger. Last week, we ended with a very brief cooling down period for our cunning criminals following a wild heist up in Racine, Wisconsin, which saw the cops intervening on the gang for the first time mid-robbery at the American Bank and Trust Company. The crew made an insane escape, using hostages as literal shields on their getaway car. It's amazing more people didn't die that day, but this story is only going to get bloodier as it goes along on all sides. And I'm now pretty confident this will go to 4 parts, with the 5th that will deal mainly with the myths, conspiracy theories, and answering any listener questions about the case. After that, there will be a short break of a week or two as I prepare for the next cases coming our way in mid or late October. But for now, it's time to settle back into 1933. Winter is coming, and there are few places in the U.S. where the cold bites harder than Chicago. Perhaps if Dillinger hadn't returned to the Windy City after his little Thanksgiving vacation to Arkansas, things would have ended differently for him. Or perhaps they would have ended the very same way in a different city. It seems nothing shy of a bullet to the head was ever going to stop him. Dillinger's growing celebrity and mythical status was a perfect storm, a Category 4 mayhem leaning perilously close to a Category 5, and it was being fed by multiple fronts. First among them was law enforcement. Outgunned and routinely outwitted, at least in the beginning, they were desperate to assert order over the chaos and were willing to leverage public fear of roaming homicidal goons in order to grow their ranks and raw firepower bigger than ever before. Second was a thirsty and fawning yellow media, serving as both the bullhorn for the police to whip up that public fear and the thorn in their sides if it meant they could sell a more salacious story to keep the eyeballs on their papers by publishing information that made it harder for police to catch him. This is rarely an accident. If cops catch the bad guys, the stories dry up. So the press treated Dillinger more as a dashing anti-hero in a modern-day Robin Hood story, and people couldn't get enough of it. Which then brings me to the people, the ones struggling through so much economic strife that came at the hands of greedy crooks of a different variety. The masses lapped up these stories of the terror gangs and other gangster exploits, if anything, to have an escape from their own worries for a few minutes every day. A lot of people wanted to see themselves in Dillinger, a tough guy robbing a level of the establishment that had recently bankrupted the nation. I can't stress enough how much the circumstances of the Great Depression really affected the flavor of what was going on here. All of you listening have likely lived through the Great Recession of 2008, and that one paled greatly in comparison to what was happening here. We're talking a difference of, say, an 8% unemployment rate in 2008 recession compared to a 25 to 30% unemployment rate during the Great Depression. Which was why we also can't forget all those greedy crooks who were still residing in places of power and their role in elevating Dillinger to living legend status. The ones who saw the value in deploying ruthless sociopaths to do their dirty work. Who better to hide behind as they continued their campaign of illicit wealth building through staged bank robberies and insurance frauds, which I spoke of a little in the last episode. It was a potluck of avarice and violence, and everyone was bringing their own special dish to the party. But Chicago police, probably less enamored with famous criminals given their previous entanglements with the likes of Al Capone, wanted Dillinger dead, straight up. They were very loud about saying so too. One Chicago police captain, John Steig, was quoted as saying, "We hope, although their trails are cold, to be able to drive them out of town or bury them. We'd prefer the latter." That's not something you'd ever hear today, at least from the more official channels. In fact, the whole concept of wanted dead or alive would vanish almost entirely after this point in history, soon to be replaced by the FBI's 10 most wanted list you're more familiar with today. While it's always been allowable for police to use lethal force against those who are presenting an immediate threat of harm, and at one point it was even legal for police to open fire on a fleeing suspect, some people have found themselves in legal hot water for killing a wanted individual in order to collect a reward. Just ask Robert Ford, the man who shot famed outlaw Jesse James in the back of the head. He was later pardoned by the Missouri governor after his conviction, but suffice it to say that murder, at least the cold-blooded variety, is still illegal regardless of what you might have seen on any old wanted posters, even if you're taking down a public enemy number one. But back in 1933, justice was still a very swift, black and white endeavor. No one seemed to be weaving any illusions about presumed innocence here, save for Dillinger's defense attorneys, but we'll get to them later. And trials were speedy by default, it seems, with a death sentence being carried out within weeks or months of a conviction, rather than the years or hell decades we see today. Dillinger and his men knew they were as good as dead if caught, which only fueled their desire to keep going at any cost. But the gang was soon to learn the game would keep racking up points on the scoreboard, even when they were in a self-imposed timeout. While Dillinger, Pierpont, and their girlfriends were away on holiday to the south, plenty of robberies, murders, and kidnappings in and around the Midwest were being pinned on them by either the police or the newspapers hungry for more eyeballs. While he was on a second holiday in Florida around Christmas of '33, which I'll be discussing in more detail in a second, he read an article where someone accused him of shooting a dog during a Michigan robbery that was falsely attributed to him. A bemused Dillinger apparently replied, "How could I shoot a dog from all the way down here? I wonder if its name was Matt," referring to his arch nemesis, Captain Matt Leach of the Indiana State Police, of course. But I can't have too much sympathy for Dillinger being blamed for the actions of his many colleagues and copycats. He benefited greatly from his own notoriety, but it comes with a cost, namely that of being the public's favorite scapegoat. By this point in the story, although Dillinger himself hadn't killed anyone, other members of his gang had, and guilt by association was enough to make a murderer out of him. And of course, that only added fuel to that perfect storm I mentioned a moment ago. But the newspapers also weren't above satire when it came to pinning every sin post Adam and Eve on the famed outlaw. My main source for this series refers to one article from the Chicago Tribune during this time that I found quite amusing, though police at the time certainly did not. Here's what it says. Mr. Dillinger was seen yesterday looking over the new spring gloves in a State Street store in Chicago, negotiating for a 12-cylinder car in Springfield, Illinois, buying a half-dozen sassy cravats in Omaha, Nebraska, bargaining for a suburban bungalow at his hometown of Mooresville, Indiana, drinking a glass of soda water in a drugstore in Charleston, South Carolina, and strolling down Broadway, swinging a Malacca cane in New York. He also bought a fishing rod in a sporting goods store in Montreal and gave a dinner in a hotel in Yucatan, Mexico. But anyhow, Mr. Dillinger seems to have kept very carefully out of London, Berlin, Rome, Moscow, and even Vienna. Or at least if he did go to these places yesterday, he was traveling incognito. That's quite spicy, if I do say so. Dillinger's own feelings on all this could be found in a letter he wrote to his niece Mary, dated New Year's Day, 1934. He writes, "I see in the papers where I'm robbing cabarets and most anything that comes along, but you know that's a lie, don't you, honey? When I steal anything, it isn't going to be a few $100s. Always with the cocky swagger, that guy. When Dillinger and Billy Frechette returned to Chicago in early December, the city's police, which had taken a breather on the increasingly violent manhunt, were whipped right back up into a righteous fury thanks to a nasty deed by one of Dillinger's own men, John Hamilton. While dropping off a vehicle at a body shop for repair, Hamilton, accompanied by his girlfriend, encountered police officer William Shanley, who'd been there on a stakeout, acting on a tip that the gang liked to use the place. Despite not having any backup, the impatient Shanley decided to try and take Hamilton down on his own and received a bullet in his chest for his troubles. Hamilton fled into the city while Shanley, who'd been a decorated and very well-liked officer in the community, died later that day at a local hospital. Hamilton's girlfriend was left behind to be apprehended by police, though she managed to escape any serious charges when she was able to convince them that she didn't know her new beau's actual line of work, claiming she thought he was just a rich heir. Feigned ignorance would become a signature move for a lot of the women who ran in Dillinger's circle. Kicked into overdrive, the trigger-happy Chicago PD captain John Steig, whom I mentioned a moment ago, assembled an elite group of marksmen to roam the streets at night with strict orders to shoot to kill. They also continued to use wiretaps on the phones of Dillinger's known associates to keep tabs on him, staging raids in multiple apartment complexes where the bandit had been holing up, though Dillinger always managed to clear out in the nick of time. The phone taps would soon be rendered useless when Chicago newspapers learned about that particular bit of spy tech and put it on blast. Remember, at this point in time, phones and the means by which to tap them were still very new to the world, and the laws governing their use were also not quite in place yet. The idea that the cops could be listening in on your phone calls no doubt increased the paranoia, not only of the gang, but anyone who picked up a handset. And police were about to grow even more infuriated when an encounter with one of the terror gang's erstwhile members resulted in one more dead cop. Remember when I briefly mentioned a man named Ed Schaus in the last episode? The guy who couldn't keep his eyes off of Dillinger's girl and was expelled from the group? Well, his story didn't end there. He'd be confronted by Indiana State Troopers in front of the France Hotel in Paris, Illinois, a town just over the state border due west of Indianapolis. When Schaus fled on foot, police began shooting. In a tragic incident of friendly fire, however, Lieutenant Chester Butler shot rookie officer Eugene Teague in the head, killing him instantly. Butler was so shaken up by the incident that he would resign from the force. Schaus sustained no wounds and was arrested. Captain Matt Leach of the ISP would blame Dillinger for Teague's death. Sent back to the Michigan City prison to serve out the remainder of his term, Schaus would not be charged in the death either, but he would nevertheless open his mouth and start singing everything he knew, which admittedly wasn't all that much, given he'd been kicked out of the gang a couple months prior and didn't have much current info. But through Schaus, the cops would learn about some of the stolen bonds the gang had offloaded, as well as a planned heist in Muncie, Indiana, that went bust because of Harry Copeland's drunkenness. Schaus also spilled info about a gang hideout on the 30th floor of a high-rise on Randolph Street in Chicago, which turned out to belong to a different gang entirely. Captain Steeg's assassin squad nevertheless would raid that pad and kill 3 of the men inside. This was intended to send a very loud message to anyone listening. The Chicago police were not messing around. Just before Christmas, another of the gang's loose ends, Hilton Crouch, who'd been part of the robbery of the Massachusetts Avenue Bank in Indianapolis, was rounded up and thrown back in Michigan City with Schaus and Copeland. The police seemed to be doing a decent enough job of mopping up the smaller players, but the 5 core members, John Dillinger, Harry Pierpont, Charles Mackley, John Hamilton, and Russell Clark, they decided it was time to hit the road again. They and their ladies piled into 3 separate cars and began making their way out of Chicago, heading south. After John and Billy stopped off at his family's place to drop off some Christmas presents, they planned to rendezvous with the group in Nashville a few days later. There's one incident that happened during the trip, though, which I wanted to mention because it just shows yet again how lucky this core crew still was, at least for the time being. Russell Clark, his wife Bernice, and his sister-in-law Pat wrecked their shiny new Ford on the highway near the Kentucky-Indiana border. Bernice was the only one injured, having been knocked unconscious. When she came to in the ambulance, she was immediately aware of her precarious position, what with the suitcases full of guns and money in the car, as well as a cool $4,000 tucked inside her shoes, which she refused to allow the hospital staff to remove from her feet while they treated her. In a bid to remain as lucid as possible and not inadvertently spill any info, Bernice even refused pain-relieving drugs while they stitched up the gash in her forehead. Meanwhile, her husband was back at the Evansville police station filling out paperwork for the accident, and it was a place he knew well. Evansville cops had busted him for a robbery there back in 1926. Clark even recognized a number of the police officers who'd hunted him down, though they didn't appear to recognize him back. Maybe it was because he was dressed like a tourist and sporting an alias, but invariably, people believe the stories we tell them. Clark managed to complete his business there without incident, as well as pay for the truck driver's damages on the spot, all while his luggage full of guns and money sat right there in the station lobby, no one the wiser. He would then take a taxi to the hospital and meet back up with his wife and sister-in-law. With their car wrecked, they chartered a plane to take them the rest of the way to Tennessee, where Dillinger and Hamilton were already staying at the Hermitage Hotel. Clark would soon pick up another vehicle. A few days later, on December 17th, Dillinger and Billy departed for Daytona Beach, Florida, where they rented a 3-story oceanfront mansion under the alias Frank Kirtley. There, they'd spend a sun-soaked few weeks, swimming, sunbathing, and horseback riding on the beach and buying all sorts of new cars and clothes and various other fineries for one another for Christmas. It was a fine enough time, even as Dillinger monitored the newspapers and learned scores of other robberies being attributed to him back home. Snitches informed Captain Matt Leach the gang was headed down toward Florida, so he contacted several police departments down there to inform them of the dangerous men in their midst. Unfortunately, though, Leach assumed the gang would be heading down toward Miami, which is nowhere near Daytona Beach, so his efforts were all for naught. After ringing in the new year on the beach, the group split back up again and headed back for the Midwest. Billy Frechette would return by herself to the reservation in Neopit, Wisconsin, to visit her family for a bit. Later that first week of 1934, another loose-end member of the terror gang, Walter Dietrich, was arrested, making him the 4th of the 10 escapees to be returned back to the Indiana pen. For reasons I'll never fully understand, Dillinger and Hamilton decided to make East Chicago, which is actually in Indiana, about 20 miles away from the actual Chicago, the site of their next big heist. Why not stay in Florida and start knocking over banks down there? Or heck, in any of the 40-some other states they could have hit. Paradoxically, though, they probably felt safer back home, despite how much riskier it now was. Derry Matera's book suggests it's because the First National Bank of East Chicago was right across the street from a place called Alice's Delicatessen, which was owned by the sister of someone Dillinger knew from his Michigan City shirt factory days, a man named Freddie Brenman. And Freddie had already cased the joint for them, apparently. Personally, I just think it's a bad idea to return to a place where thousands of bloodthirsty cops are looking to put you in the ground. But maybe that was part of the appeal, too. After spending months building this brazen brand, which included robbing 2 police stations, the prodigal son wanted to come back home with a bang. And so it was on the afternoon of January 15th, Johnny and Jack Hamilton strolled into the lobby of the bank, while an idling Ford V8 waited across the street with a getaway driver who was never identified, waiting behind the wheel. Unlike a lot of their previous, more rural bank jobs, this one was bustling with a couple dozen men, women, and children. Dillinger approached a teller and announced the robbery, while Hamilton separated the women and children, herding them into a safer corner of the bank while lining up the men firing squad style against a wall, telling them to keep their hands up. As Hamilton began stuffing money into the bags, the bank's vice president, who'd been in his office on the phone when this all started going down, told his colleague on the other end there was a robbery in progress. He also triggered the silent alarm. And again, you're not going to believe this. Just like back in Racine, the police at the East Chicago headquarters responded more with annoyance than anything else. Apparently, these silent alarm systems were pretty finicky and went off falsely on a regular basis. But Detective William O'Malley gathered up a few patrolmen to accompany him down to the bank on foot. There was nothing as they approached the building that suggested a robbery was going down inside. But as they entered the bank, O'Malley immediately found himself face to face with John Dillinger and the barrel of his Tommy gun. O'Malley and one of the other officers immediately backed out of the bank, leaving 2 of the other officers inside. He steeled himself against the side of the building, gun in hand, while the other officer ran to a nearby drugstore to call for backup. This is again where a 2-way radio would have really come in handy, but alas, that technology lag I spoke of in the previous episode struck again. Dillinger stripped the 2 officers inside of their firearms and emptied them. He then told Jack to finish grabbing up all the money. They knew more cops would soon be bearing down, so just like the robbery up in Racine, they intended to use human shields to aid their getaway. Police were arriving just as Dillinger and Hamilton, now about 20 grand richer, made their way outside with their 2 patrolmen blocking any potential gunfire. They didn't see Sergeant O'Malley pressed against the building with his .38 aimed right at Dillinger's head. But he couldn't quite make the shot without risking hitting Officer Wilgus. In a moment that would seal both Dillinger's and O'Malley's fates, the sergeant called out Officer Wilgus's name, and Wilgus quickly ducked. O'Malley fired his pistol 4 times, plugging John Dillinger square in the chest. Only Dillinger didn't go down. Saved by one of the bulletproof vests he's stolen from a police armory, he angrily fired his Thompson at O'Malley, officially minting himself as a cop killer, no longer just one by association. Jack Hamilton would sustain several gunshots in areas not protected by his vest, but Dillinger would manage to haul him back to the getaway car. They squealed away, quite foolishly, back to the Lion's Den of Chicago, but they didn't have much choice, I guess. With Hamilton's injuries, they needed to go somewhere they had connections to get him fixed up. Enter disgraced alcoholic doctor Joseph Moran, who'd been twice jailed for performing botched illegal abortions that got at least a couple young women killed. Moran's story only sounds a little similar to Dillinger's, especially the claim that he'd befriended a lot of mob figures during his time in prison, and so had a steady line of work waiting for him when he got out, mostly yanking bullets out of men too hot to go to the hospital, in other words. Hamilton was in a pretty sorry state by the time they made it to Moran. He'd been shot 7 times, mostly up around his shoulders and once on his hip, and he'd lost a lot of blood. Moran charged a whopping $5,000 for his services, by the way, and that's in 1933 money. Today, in 2024, that would be around $121,000, which sounds closer to a standard hospital bill here in the United States, now that I think of it. Hamilton would need a few weeks to recover. In the meantime, cops would find their blood-soaked getaway car fully reigniting Chicago's manhunt. They really shouldn't have gone home. Dillinger knew it was a bad idea to hang around Chicago any longer. With Billy fresh from her family visit in Wisconsin, the two reunited again in St. Louis and then continued to trek west for the desert. Tucson, Arizona, to be precise, where Charles Mackley, Harry Pierpont, and Russell Clark were already ingratiating themselves with the locals under the mistaken assumption that nobody out there would recognize them. And this is where hubris and naivete make a rather squiggly intersection. They thought they could roll into what they considered a desolate backwater town, their words, not mine, 1,700 miles across the country, driving shiny new automobiles, one of which was so new it was the first of its kind. And they were draped in the finest of clothing, their ladies bedecked with luxurious furs and sparkling jewels. And they thought nobody would notice them? It's particularly funny considering the reason they'd originally moved up to Chicago was so they could blend in better with the locals in a more metropolitan environment. But I think there's a point in any successful criminal's career where the ego, bolstered from that success, begins to outweigh common sense. And for the terror gang, those scales began tipping when they robbed the bank in East Chicago. The fact that they barely got away and that one of their own men ended up riddled with bullets should have humbled them just a little bit. Instead, it turned into a situation of what doesn't kill you makes you even more reckless. But the gang left their collective brains somewhere east of the Mississippi as they set out for Tucson, and they were too high on their own fumes to realize they were walking into their own doom. Pretty much immediately, one guy in town recognized Russell Clark from a story about his crimes in True Detective magazine. Then Clark and Charles Mackley got into a pissing match with a couple of salesmen in a bar over how many machine guns they owned. So much for thinking it was just the women who needed to watch their loose lips with alcohol. Those salesmen ended up reporting the incident to the police the following morning, who picked up Mackley and his new girlfriend at a shop in town for questioning. Mackley, of course, used an alias and offered to take them by his place to prove his identity. The police instead dropped him off at the station and headed over to the house he was sharing with Clark and his wife. After a brief wrestling match that saw Clark knocked over the head with his own gun, he too was arrested. Harry Pierpont, meanwhile, had just managed to avoid being nabbed when he swung by the house an hour later and saw the place turned all upside down from the earlier scuffle. Knowing Clark and Mackley had likely been arrested, he quickly skedaddled back to his place to grab Mary and head out of town. Had he not stopped to make a quick phone call to hire a lawyer for his two fallen comrades, he might have made it out in time. But then again, the police were already onto him. That's because when he stopped by the Clark house, a neighbor who'd probably been watching when the first arrest went down phoned the police and gave them Pierpont's license plate number. And the police already knew the address associated with that plate because Pierpont had received a traffic ticket for running a stop sign the day he arrived in town. Again, the events of Tucson with this gang are a bit like watching a Rube Goldberg device fueled by dumb mistakes. So the Tucson police catch up to Pierpont's exotic new Buick and pull him over, under the guise of telling him he needed to have a tourist sticker on his vehicle during his stay. Somehow, the police convinced Pierpont to accompany them back to the station. Apparently, Pierpont suspected nothing yet, or maybe he felt assured that he could get out of any tight jam involving police, given his history of jailbreaks and station raids. At any rate, once he was at the station, the cops made their move to arrest him. Pierpont's attempts to pull his guns failed, and when they had him on the ground, old hothead Harry revealed himself, and he screamed that he'd get all 3 of those small-town hick cops and that he could get out of any jail they put him in. On his person, those small-town hick cops, by the way, also found the .38 revolver belonging to Sheriff Jess Sarber of Lima, Ohio, sealing his fate in regards to that murder with a pretty little bow. Police also recovered about $15,000 in cash from the belongings of Mackley Clark and their ladies, as well as any guns and jewelry they were hanging on to. Meanwhile, you're probably wondering where our main fella is in the midst of all this. Well, Johnny and Billy were completely unaware for most of that day that the majority of his crew had been pinched. They were busy setting up their new rental, stocking it with groceries and coal for the fireplace. By that evening, they were looking to meet up with friends. And Dillinger drove them over to Charles Mackley's place, where police had been waiting for him to show up. After a brief moment of trying to feign as a businessman named Frank Sullivan who'd had the wrong address, Dillinger soon fessed up when he was staring down several cops with guns pointed at him. They recovered another $7,000 in cash from Dillinger, as well as a small amount of money from Billy, as well as a Boston Terrier puppy she'd had with her, which was a Christmas gift from her beloved. In Derry Matera's book, he points out that this hilarious detail that the dog had been wearing a special mask on its face to protect its eyes from the desert dust. And for a second, the police apparently wondered if the duo had been carrying chemical weapons. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I guess with someone of Dillinger's cachet, you can never be too careful. They did allow Dillinger to keep a rabbit's foot charm that he'd bought earlier, about which Dillinger replied, "That rabbit was a lot luckier than I was." By the time everyone was back at the station and all their possessions fully accounted for, the police had recovered upwards of $27,000 and enough guns and ammo to, quote, supply 3 Mexican revolutions. Serial numbers on money recovered from Dillinger would be linked back to the bank in East Chicago, tying him to that robbery, which of course had involved the slaying of a police officer. More than that, these small-town hick cops, as Pierpont called them, had managed to do what 4 state police forces, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Wisconsin, as well as the feds, had been unable to do up to this point: round up the most famous gang of outlaws of the 20th century, and they'd done it without having to fire a single bullet. The media descended on Tucson like a flock of starving buzzards, and this is when the circus really began. On the day of the arraignment, the courtroom was packed to bursting as Dillinger, Pierpont, Clark, and Mackley were brought in and shackled together, and they pled not guilty, of course. Despite their defense attorney arguing that bail could only be imposed on those who'd committed crimes in Arizona, the judge levied a $100,000 bond on each man. An APB had also been put out for the one remaining straggler, Jack Hamilton, but he was still laid up in Chicago, recovering from his wounds. Bernice, Billy, and Mary were also arraigned, with their bond set at $5,000 each, though I'll quickly sum up that where the ladies were concerned, again, all of them would eventually be set free, either due to a lack of hard evidence or the idiotic and, of course, patriarchal belief that they were all too stupid to know what sort of men they were running with. Hooray, I guess? The Gawkers, of course, couldn't get enough of seeing Dillinger and Billy together. None of them wanted to believe that this gentle, loving man was the ruthless monster the media had purported him to be. The sideshow continued when various seized assets were put on display for people to gaze upon with awe. Dillinger's vehicle was set up in front of a local dealership with a banner reading, "Dillinger chooses the 1934 Hudson for personal use." The houses they were staying in were quickly flipped by a local realtor to be rented out as historical sites for a pretty penny. The sheriff even allowed thousands of people to walk through the jailhouse to view the caged criminals like prized zoo animals. He'd soon stopped that little spectacle, however, when reports came in that gangs from back east were gunning for Tucson, ostensibly to pull another Lima job to break Dillinger and the rest of the gang free. The police themselves weren't immune to the celebrity and charms of the terror gang either. The men gifted the cops their favorite revolvers. Mackley gave one of them an amethyst ring belonging to him. All of these assets were purchased with ill-gotten gains, of course, and there were folks in several states vying for a piece of the loot, but I suppose a few souvenirs were in order. And of course, the men themselves were happy to give reporters any and all requested interviews. Dillinger provided a few juicy quotes I'll go ahead and give you here. "You're framing me for crimes I never even read about. You can't keep me in any 2x4 jail cell. I'll get out and kill you all." And there was also this one. "I'm an expert in my business. I can play tag with the police anytime. They just dodge around the old trails like hounds that don't know what's going on. And the dumbest ones in the world are the Chicago kind. Right now, none of these smart aleck coppers have got a bit of evidence that I killed anybody or robbed any bank, and they can't keep me penned up anywhere, here, Atlanta, Leavenworth, or Alcatraz Island, any more than they can keep my men in Ohio or Indiana." And what did the reporters themselves have to say about all this? Well, they really had a hard-on for the machismo on display here. Here's a quote from Walter Naughton of the Chicago Herald and Examiner. "John Dillinger is as tough an individual as your reporter has ever seen, and I have looked at many a tough one in the eye." I'd like to say the modern-day media is far less enamored with the personalities of charismatic criminals, but I think we know better. You might also be wondering if any reporters had taken a visit back to the Dillinger family farm out in Mooresville to see what John Sr. had to make of all this. And yes, the media pretty much camped out there permanently as this whole saga raged on. Here's one quote from him. "I kind of hoped John would get out of the country before he got caught, but maybe this way is best. I was so afraid that when they tried to close in on him, he would shoot somebody or get shot. I couldn't bear to think of that." And what did Johnny Jr. have to say about that? "That's fine of Dad. He was a great scout. I'm sorry I've caused him so much worry, but well, that's just how life goes. We can't all be angels." He apparently wrapped up that interview by gifting the reporter his not-so-lucky rabbit's foot and putting in a ringing endorsement for the Tucson sheriff's re-election campaign, which had the effect of making Dillinger's life a little easier in the jail. Even the Arizona governor, B.B. Moyer, popped on down to Tucson for a photo op and to shoot the breeze with the boys like they were old friends, particularly with Charles Mackley, as apparently the two men had a few mutual acquaintances. Amid this crazy circus, however, were very serious questions of rewards and extradition. Everyone involved in the reports leading to the gang's arrest were quickly trying to lay a claim to the slice of a $30,000 reward pot. Of course, the gang all preferred to be hauled back to Wisconsin, where the charges were far less severe, what with no dead cops and all. But Captain Matt Leach of Indiana was absolutely not going to let that happen. He'd arrived on the scene in Tucson, taken by train, to lobby in person for his right to gain custody of these guys, and he put a real damper on the party for everyone, declaring to the press, "This stamps out the so-called Dillinger gang." Leach, of course, wanted Dillinger shipped back to Indiana, given the murder of Sergeant O'Malley in the East Chicago bank heist, but also because Dillinger had been his singular obsession for the last several months, and he was happy to relinquish Pierpont and Mackley to Allen County, Ohio for the murder of Sheriff Sarber, and would probably throw in Russell Clark along for the ride. But it wasn't so simple. All 4 men had signed extradition agreements to Wisconsin, which the sheriff and the local judge had endorsed, given Wisconsin was ponying up $6,000 in reward money and offering to pay the travel costs. All the invested parties from the other states, of course, lost their minds. Captain Leach especially, who'd secured a separate extradition agreement from the Arizona governor. This, along with Leach making maneuvers with the governors of Illinois and Ohio, forced Wisconsin's governor to cave on the original agreement. Leach won this fight, much to the rage of Dillinger, who screamed he was being railroaded. Leach had also scored custody of the other 3 men in the bargain, so everyone was headed back to Indiana, at least for now. It was also rumored that Dillinger had sweetened the pot with Arizona and Wisconsin officials by offering up some $60,000 in stolen and washed government bond money. Alas, Leach's deal meant that no one would be getting any rewards. A few $100 went to the arresting officers, no more than that. Leach had made enemies on both sides of the law, but at least he had his men. Back in Wisconsin, Racine prosecutor John Brown bitterly quipped, "Indiana, a state which turned these mobsters loose on the Middle West, has Dillinger in custody again. It's hoped that the negligence of the officers of that state will never be repeated." Mackley, Clark, and Pierpont were quickly herded onto a train headed for Indiana, where they'd be sent back to the Michigan City prison to join their friends. There, they'd be interrogated between stints in solitary before Leach would turn them over to Ohio officials to stand trial for the murder of Sheriff Sarber. Meanwhile, Dillinger was dragged kicking and screaming onto a different vehicle, an airplane, figuring no one would be coming to free the folk hero all the way up in the sky. It was no luxury, though. The commercial airline industry was in its early infancy, and the trip from Tucson required a very long series of hops across a half-dozen airports or so before touching down in Chicago. There waited a 150-officer detail led by Captain John Steig, he of the Chicago Assassin Squad, to escort Dillinger to the Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. Filling out that detail further were 2 squads of Illinois State Police and 6 squads of Indiana troopers. Of course, this was as much to Dillinger's benefit as anyone's. Steig wanted to kill Dillinger, remember? It's what he'd been tasked to do. But well, that wasn't going to be so easy with all these witnesses around. That said, they were hoping Dillinger would just give them a good reason to blow him away. Alas, he was a good boy for the trip. And when he arrived at the jail in Crown Point that evening, his mood immediately brightened. It was just another small-town jail, by all appearances, not much different at all from the one he'd busted out of in Lima. But the Lake County Sheriff was not what Dillinger expected. She was a woman. Lillian Holly was 43 years old, having assumed the position of sheriff after her husband was killed in the line of duty. During a press conference, prosecutor Robert Estill was photographed with Dillinger, and the picture of the two looking all chummy together, his arm around Dillinger's shoulders with Dillinger leaning on him with a grin pasted across his face, became immediately famous and riddled with scandal. Being seen as appearing to buddy up to the famous criminal would ultimately doom Estill's attempts to seek higher political office, and I'm sure J. Edgar Hoover had something to do with that. Despite the fact that Dillinger was making a gun sign with his thumb and forefinger in the picture, alluding to Dillinger's fans that Estill needed to be taken out. About this, Estill would later say, "It seems that people would want me to glare at Dillinger. I believe such a pose would be sheer hypocrisy. A prosecutor should not cease to be human. Dillinger acted like a gentleman with me, and I was duty-bound to treat him likewise. I will do everything in my power to send Dillinger to the electric chair for the murder of Detective O'Malley." And to his credit, he would also later reportedly refuse a deal for Dillinger to plead guilty in exchange for life in prison. It seems he really did want to see Dillinger fry. The reporters Dillinger spoke with during the presser continued to be charmed by the outlaw, finding it difficult to square their stories of this ruthless killer with a man who appeared to be treating this whole thing casually, as a joke or something that would soon be over with. Dillinger admitted to some minor crimes, but denied any of the ones resulting in dead bodies, of course. He also claimed, "I don't drink much and I smoke very little. When you rob banks, you can't very well do a lot of drinking. I guess my only bad habit is robbing banks." Here's what one reporter from the Chicago Daily News had to say about Dillinger. "Looking at him for the first time, one could hardly realize that in a very few days, a month or two at the outside, this cheery, affable young man will probably be a corpse, and a very good one. For though the finger is definitely on Mr. Dillinger, he still rates in the eyes of calloused observers as the most amazing specimen of his kind ever seen outside of a wildly imaginative moving picture." In other words, to them, Dillinger was bigger than life, a movie star. But of course, as was inevitable with this gang, their immediate thoughts turned to the logistics of escape. Both Dillinger and Pierpont told police that Jack Hamilton was dead in the hopes that he could help them engineer their plans. Dillinger would need help from the outside to pull off such a feat, of course, and who better than his freshly hired defense attorney, Louis P. Paquette, who seems like a direct inspiration for the character of Saul Goodman from Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. Apparently, he never even attended law school, having acquired his license by passing the bar exam on his 4th attempt. While he milled about in various Chicago legal circles, in particular the prosecutor's office for a time in the 1920s, he was a regular attendee of banquets thrown by Al Capone. After running into a few legal scuffles he eventually got out of, he switched over to working as a defense attorney, where things are a little less black and white on the rules front. At his arraignment, Dillinger would plead not guilty, and a trial date was set for a month out on March 12th. Prosecutor Estill was likely well aware of the defense attorney's less than legal tactics, and he desperately wanted Dillinger shipped up to await trial in Michigan City. But the judge was reluctant to offend Sheriff Holly and all the other women of Lake County. The sheriff responded by further beefing up security in the jail with more cops and even some National Guard troops. She also read all of Dillinger's mail herself and denied him any visitors, to which his attorney squawked with outrage. That said, Paquette could pass notes from Dillinger to Billy Frechette, and in one such note, he discovered his client was planning a big escape, which involved dynamiting the wall of the jail and taking out guards with machine guns. Apparently, Paquette passed the note on for fear of angering Dillinger, but something tells me he didn't feel too terrible about it. Meanwhile, Jack Hamilton wasn't feeling too keen on the plan, considering it too risky. What he wasn't revealing to any of them was that he'd fallen for one of Billy Frechette's girlfriends, Pat Charrington, who'd been nursing him back to health. And Pat, meanwhile, was spilling all sorts of incriminating info to the feds about Dillinger's activities in Florida, as well as the transaction with the mob doctor who treated Jack for his gunshot wounds. She didn't, however, reveal Jack's location. On March 3rd, the cautiously tranquil facade at the Crown Point Jail would forever be shattered. That day, a 60-year-old handyman named Sam Cahoon opened the cell doors to allow the inmates to go to breakfast in the jail's day room. For whatever reason, Cahoon left the main cell block door open while the prisoners were still in the walkway. Dillinger made his move, rushing for the open door and throwing Cahoon against the wall and shoving a pistol under his chin. More on that pistol in a second. He told him, "I don't want to kill anyone, so just do what I say." Dillinger and a few trustees ordered Cahoon to close the doors, locking some inmates and a guard inside a couple of the cells. Then, using Cahoon as a shield and flanked by some inmates interested in helping in the escape and probably escaping themselves, Dillinger made his way down the corridor until he encountered a fingerprint technician named Ernest Blunk. Dillinger threatened Cahoon with his gun and demanded Blunk do as he was told. Cahoon, under orders, sealed Blunk in another cell. The trek through the jail continued, and Dillinger ordered Cahoon to fetch the jail warden, Lou Baker. After Cahoon refused, Dillinger, again, not really in the mood to kill anyone, fetched Blunk from his cell and forced him to do it. Stunningly, no one was putting up a fight here. There were opportunities for some of these people to escape or sound alarms, but Dillinger clearly had them in control. Maybe it was just that image, that reputation that preceded him. Blunk summoned Warden Baker, and Dillinger quickly shoved the pistol against his back and escorted him to the cell block and locked him up with the rest. At this point, Dillinger wasn't sure what to do next, so he continued to use Blunk to summon various guards, and then one by one lock them up in cells. One of these men, a deputy named Kenneth Houch, did resist and try to grab Dillinger's wrist, but the inmates assisting him managed to restrain him and get him into a cell. The same went for another guard, as well as the jail's gatekeeper. After Dillinger demanded from the warden to tell him where the guns were kept, Baker said they were kept in his office. After acquiring a fresh Tommy gun and releasing a few more inmates to form a new gang for himself, at least temporarily, Dillinger and the group made their way back to Warden Baker's cell and brandished the pistol he'd used to make it all happen. It thudded dully against the cell bars, sounding not of metal, but of wood, which Dillinger claimed he'd carved himself. Now, there's a small but vocal faction of Dillinger historians out there who claim that this detail about the gun is apocryphal and that it was more likely Dillinger's lawyer that had smuggled in a pistol for him. But there are pictures of this wooden gun out there, including on the FBI's website, and a lot of witnesses appear to attest to this very scene. They also noted that Dillinger had struggled to maintain a grip on the weapon during the escape, and that's probably because the carved gun lacked any kind of handle. Dillinger's manner throughout most of this escape could be described as calm, methodical, and in some cases, lackadaisical. Even once they were out of the jailhouse, Dillinger returned to the cell block to inquire with the warden again about car keys. A number of helpers Dillinger had amassed chickened out, fearing that they had taken too long and that they would encounter a wall of guards as they fled the facility. But that wasn't to be so. Dillinger would actually steal Sheriff Hawley's personal vehicle, a Ford V8, to make his getaway. He'd also kidnapped the mechanic who'd been stationed in the garage and took him along for the ride. And once they were clear of town, he'd have the mechanic remove the police fog lights mounted on the car's bumper. Along the route, with Ernest Blunk behind the wheel, the vehicle would cross state lines into Illinois, which might seem like no big deal at first until you remember one little factoid about J. Edgar Hoover's bureau that I mentioned in the previous episode. Up until this point in the story, there still wasn't much they could do, as their new powers were still winding their way through the congressional digestive tract, but they could intervene on stolen vehicles crossing state lines. The G-Men were soon to be fully in play, and as promised, you're going to be hearing more about one particular Fed that Dillinger helped make famous, Melvin Purvis. But with Dillinger back on the loose again, the bloodiest chapter of this tale, as well as its conclusion, will have to wait until next week. I hope you've been enjoying this stunning tale as much as I have. Although I've tried to include as much detail as possible, there's so much more that had to be left out in the interest of time. If you have any questions about Dillinger or any of the other players in this saga, or if you think I got something wrong, shoot me an email at vintagevillainspod@gmail.com or head over to the Facebook group to start a discussion. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters, by the way, who keep this time machine running for a mere $3 a month. Anyway, it's time I headed out, but I'll see you next week. Until then, you know what to do. Get out there and make good history, and I'll see you next time in another century.